Good, af- good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to people joining this particular webinar on anonymous access to PAP sequences, PAP sequence information. We ask this question whether it is open access or open exploitation leading to biopiracy. Today, we have three important practitioners from the ground who work with pathogens, bioinformatics, and public health to address the gathering. And I'm Nitin Ramakrishnan from Third World Networks, senior researcher. I'll be moderating the session and also we'll be making a short, small introductory explanation regarding the particular context and background of this webinar. Before going into the introduction to the webinar, I would like to introduce the invited speakers who have kindly accepted our invitation to come here and discuss their views on this particular issue. So beginning with Dr. Timothy Poisat, is a prominent quantitative and computational ecologist and a full professor at the Department of Biological Sciences at University of Montreal. He's director of EPIC Biodiversity Lab, where his research focuses on understanding complex ecological systems, biodiversity loss, disease emergence. He actually works on issues associated with viral emergence and zoonosis, and also develops predictive models to map new risk of pandemics. He also works with network ecology and a very, very vocal advocate of open science and how it relates to benefit sharing. We also have Dr. Taimi Sylvester, a prominent biomedical scientist, senior lecturer, and public health advocate based in Namibia. She works with the University of Namibia Science and Technology. She works issues associated with animal TB and immunology, molecular epidemiology, as well as One Health and artificial intelligence. Her current interest includes using AI to drive health innovation and monitoring antimicrobial resistance. We also have Tulio de Lima Campos, a leading researcher in pathogen genomics and bioinformatics, primarily associated with Fiocruz in Brazil. He serves as a public health technologist and head of bioinformatics core facility at Fiocruz, Pernambuco, if I'm correct with my pronunciation of the place. His expertise focuses on genomics of parasites, pathogens, and disease vectors, including through using machine learning and omics technologies. The development of viral flow and automated workflow for viral genome assembly and lineage assignment. He works with automated data processing and mutation analysis, etc. So with three eminent speakers who have very practical insights relating to this particular issue, we would like to venture into this particular debate relating to anonymous access to a PABS sequence of information, whether it is open access or open exploitation. I might share my slide for a couple of minutes, and then perhaps.
While your slides open, just like to remind you to speak a bit more slowly for the interpreters.
Sure. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. I hope my screen is visible.
It is, yes.
So the background, PABS stands for Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing System, a mechanism for rapidly and timely sharing of PABS materials and sequence information on an equal footing. The rapid, timely, for promoting rapid, timely, fair and equitable sharing of benefits, which includes vaccines, therapeutic diagnostics arising from the sharing and or utilization of these resources, PABS materials and sequence information for the public health purposes. Now, what does the term PAP sequence information relies on, means on? It basically means genetic sequence data or information from the pathogens with pandemic potential shared through PAPs. For example, information on the order of nucleotides in DNA, RNA, or order of amino acids in protein molecules found in or taken from pathogens with pandemic potential. It's also otherwise known as genetic sequence data, digital sequence information, genetic sequence information, etc. Various words are used in various different international fora. And then what do we mean by anonymous access? Basically an access to data without user registration and verified logins. So our question here is, when this particular information is available in databases online, accessing them without providing verified institutional affiliation or identity and user registration, whether it is really a prerequisite for open access, or it can also be an issue associated with biopiracy, or can it facilitate biopiracy? So when we talk about this, it is also important to talk about why we are bringing this issue of at this stage, like a minimal introduction on what is happening in WHO, what is being negotiated, and why this question has arisen. So most of you would know WHO pandemic agreement, which was adopted in World Health Assembly 78, 2025. And then there was a process also established to elaborate on Article 12 mechanism of this particular treaty, which is Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing System, PABS system. As per Article 12, it has to be a mechanism which shares materials and sequence information, biological materials and sequence information coming from pathogens of pandemic potential, which then also binds into obligation and commitment to share benefits developed using this particular access. It is the Intergovernmental Working Group negotiating to elaborate how this mechanism would operate, operational dimensions. For the last 1 year, they have been negotiating. 5 rounds of negotiation has been completed. There is a new Bureau's text, which was circulated with the member states, not yet available in the public domain. Couple of days ago, I think March 9th or 10th. And then there is also further discussions regarding a last round of meeting, which would happen from March 23rd to 28th. This is the officially stated last round of the meeting of Intergovernmental Working Group before they send out their outcomes to World Health Assembly 79. So it is in this context we are entering this particular discussion. And then let me just explain a little bit also regarding what is it the Convention on Biological Diversity and other elements has to say about sequence information. If you look at sequence information issue, the Convention on Biological Diversity recently, 2024, COP16 has adopted a decision whereby they have reaffirmed the understanding of sovereign rights over genetic resources, including the sequence information generated from such resources. So when you say Article 15, which is I've copied here, you can see sovereign rights of the states. That rights is plural, and plural includes several rights, including right to determine access, utilization, terms and conditions, etc., which also includes right to determine what should happen with the sequence information generated from the genetic resources belonging to these countries, and is always subject to national legislation. Article 19 is also talking about the utilization of biotechnology and results and benefits coming from use of biotechnology to be shared with the countries or contracting parties which have shared genetic resources. To say one more thing about CBD decision 16.2 on 2024, it very clearly affirms countries' right to attach conditions to sequence data when the genetic materials are shared. It could also be done even when international ABS instruments like the PABS instrument under Article 12 of Pandemic Agreement is developed. It's very, very clear and explicit under Decision 16.2. If we look at this, what does EU law say about it? The same thing. EU Commission's guidance document on paragraph 2.3.5 very clearly says when sequence data is generated from genetic materials shared, and if there are mutually agreed terms associated with those genetic materials, then those terms can actually talk about the sequence data, and the recipients of the material has to actually abide by or follow any rights and obligations attached to that data generated from such materials through this mutually agreed term. So if there is a contract, a material transfer contract, when I share a data to someone of you, and in that contract, I place conditions regarding access or generation of data and storage and subsequent use, it has to be followed by the recipient. That's what EU laws very clearly says about it. Now, I would go into a little bit more assertive stage, more moving beyond from my role of moderator to an extent for 1 or 2 slides, where we assert what TWN views regarding anonymous access to sequence information. but the question will be open for the invited speakers to address in their own ways. From our point of view, anonymous access is really a problem, essentially because it in itself can be digital biopiracy. Such access opens a possibility of use and misuse or abuse even without detection, right? And rights holders over genetic resources are therefore kept in dark, not only about who accesses these resources, and also about research and development coming out of working on these resources and the outcomes coming out of it. It paves way for monopolization of outcomes of R&D, and it also create problems with compliance of ABS laws, respect countries and rights of countries and communities on genetic materials as well as information, and or also promoting effective benefit sharing. If you look at Article 1 of the CBD and Nagoya Protocol, it's very clear about certain objectives, and these objectives are not supported by anonymous access to sequence information. We should also keep in mind, yes?
Just to remind you to slow a bit down, please. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Sorry, thanks. So what we are trying to say with regard to Convention on Biological Diversity is very much connected with Article 12 of Pandemic Agreement, because under Article 12, paragraph 4, it is very, very clear that the PABS instrument or the annex which is being developed under the IGWIG shall be consistent with and do not run counter to the objectives of Convention on Biological Diversity and Nagoya Protocol. If we look at objectives of Convention and Nagoya Protocol, which I've copied down left and right, you can see very clearly that appropriate access to genetic resources, taking it into account all rights over those resources. Very, very clear. So if we are not respecting the rights over those resources while sharing pathogens of pandemic potential through the PAB system, then the objectives of the CBD is not met with. And also, the objectives of CBD talks about conservation of biological diversity and sustainable use, which is then translated in Article 15, which I've put it in blue here, paragraph 2 of Article 15, to say access to genetic resources for environmentally sound uses. So if you are promoting anonymous access and this particular people who are accessing this information is using it for dual use purposes, essentially, or illegitimate, irregular, illegal purposes relating to, biosecurity, it is not actually promoting environmentally sound access or environmentally sound use. So the objectives of Article 1 of CBD and Nagoya Protocol is not met directly if is violated directly if anonymous access is promoted. Now, Article 12 also talks about equal footing principle between sharing of PABS materials and sequence information, as well as benefit sharing. Now, if PABS Annex obligates parties to share sequence information, and the recipients of this information is not obligated to share benefits, then equal footing principle is violated as well. So with this, I move on to give an example regarding, I try to explain something associated with UNESCO recommendation on open science, because it's very important relating to open access. So there are two paragraphs I've quoted here, just to give a context that what open science demands out of open access, which says greater openness comes with greater responsibility. All open science actors or the governance principles of open science should include sensitivity to conflict of interest and vigilance as to social and ecological consequences. So if you don't know the person accessing and utilizing data, how are you going to be sensitive to the conflicts of interest? So if an academic researcher is about to give or is to be obligated to share benefits, and anonymous access definitely helping him to escape out of those obligations, then there is a conflict of interest which we need to address, right? So this is a context which I wanted to highlight. And it's also very important that the open science recommendation, which is unanimously adopted by all member states, which says that data should not be unfairly or inequitably extracted in the name of open science. So with this understanding of open science in the context, I raise these questions and leave open the floor to the invited speakers first and then to audience. With regard to user registration, some of questions which we want to ask is whether user registration is necessarily a prerequisite of open access. In the context of the legal rights, which we mentioned previously, can anonymous access and data access agreement, not having data access agreement, sorry for the typo, is justified, and whether the database governance is against the idea of open access or interoperability. And without user registration and data access agreement, can we have legal certainty as required under PABS systems, Article 12? So I now invite, Dr. Taimi Sylvester from University of Namibia Science and Technology. She also has an understanding about the state of play of negotiations associated with the PABS forum IGWIC. So she might also be able to give us an overall understanding about what are the major contentious issues, and probably take lead on some of answering these questions, and then we will move on to Dr. Tim and Dr. Tulio. Thank you. Taimi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nathan. I just have to correct you firstly, because we do have a University of Namibia that I'm not at. I'm at the Namibia University of Science and Technology. You might start a feud here if it goes through like that. All the academics understand on this profile. So thank you so much for providing that context. And I think that I just want to give a little bit more context, because when we're discussing open science, I think that, we have to discuss what is meant by that terminology, right? And I think that that is one of the wars, if I can say, that is being fought currently. It's this definition war. So what even counts as open access, right? But that's not the only definition that we're working here, because we're talking about accessing sequence information, and we're talking about accessing genomes. We don't even understand what counts as sequence information, because some delegations want an extremely narrow definition where it's only whole genome sequences of specific pathogens, while others want a broader scope that captures that functional information that's derived from the sequences, not just the raw code. And this matters because creating that very narrow definition creates a massive loophole, right? Can't see the speaker. Can you guys see me? Okay, so it creates this loophole where a researcher can take the pathogen, sequence it. It can then extract proteins, design mRNA templates, build vaccines, all using that derived information that under a very narrow definition falls outside of the PABS entirely. So the UNESCO Open Science recommendation is being cited by some to argue that all sequence data must be open. But I think that UNESCO never intended for that recommendation to override the sovereign rights over genetic resources. So this is a deliberate skewing of what is being said. And I think that we have to call that out, right? So when we also speak about the user registration versus open access, the dominant databases that are being pushed, such as GIS8, NCBI, GenBack, they permit that anonymous access where anyone can download the sequence data without identifying themselves, right? Without accepting terms and without, of course, having these benefit sharing obligations. And so developed country delegations argue that requiring user registration, and this is my favorite argument by all, will slow down science and it will undermine interoperability. But user registration is already standard in clinical data, in financial systems, in pharmaceutical trials. The resistance is not technical here. The resistance is completely political. So even having this conversation, anonymity is incompatible with benefit sharing. You cannot share benefits with someone if you cannot identify them, or if the users cannot be identified. That equal footing principle that those who access the PABS material have obligations matching those who provide it is completely broken down by this anonymous access. So you cannot say that we can decouple access and benefit sharing, or access from agreeing to downstream benefit sharing, because it cannot work. Also, the third thing that is really being disputed here, and the third war, is really about who governs the system, right? Who controls the system? And what we've seen with previous texts is that it's almost like WHO will simply ask the existing databases to comply with their own internal policies, not with what the member states decide, right? And that would almost hand over governance to a private or semi-private database operator, right? I think that the core thing that we get to, and I think those on the call that know me know that I can speak for days on end about these issues, but the central argument regarding open science versus registration, right? I just want to make clear that open science does not mean and should not equate to free for all, unaccountable access, right? If we say that open science means no user registration, then we are basically saying that open science means unrestricted exploitation, right? The position is openness with responsibility. That is what we see as open science. Transparency plus enforceable conditions, right? If we say that open science means provider countries upload data that companies just monetize without any return, then we have to call it what it is. It is the same colonial extraction model. Now it's just digital, right? So what we're saying is that open doesn't mean free for all with no accountability. That's not science. I don't think anyone on this call thinks that that's true science. That is just extraction. So yeah, I hope I answered those first questions.
Thank you, Dr. Tiny. Maybe I would invite Dr. Tim at the stage. Perhaps he might be able to help us with kind of breaking down the concepts like open access or interoperability, user registration, machine-to-machine learning, and how all these things fall in place, and how ABS is not against open science.
Sure. Thank you, Nitin, for the invitation and the introduction. And thank you, Timmy, for the brilliant work you've done of summarizing the key points of the discussion. I'd like to start by maybe taking a little bit of perspective on the conversation about what has been called open access during this entire negotiation process. The term of open access from an academic point of view is something that is very different, and that is usually about being able to access articles and literature. And there's been this change of meaning in the context of negotiation, where what is being called open access is really about access to data and access to the benefits of research, which is more properly understood as open science. And open science is something that, as it turns out, has a very formal definition, but also has many, many years now of community-driven consensus of what open science is. And when you really try to define what open science is supposed to stand for, it is about access first. That is true. But more importantly, I would argue it is also about being able to benefit from science and being able to contribute from science. And there is no hierarchy between access, benefits, and contribution. You need to have all three that are open in order to be able to call the process open. And whenever people are starting to argue that access is what matters most, they are willing to close off people from being able to benefit from research or being able to contribute from research. This is closed science, and that is not what we should be working towards. But more importantly, the underlying logic of open science is that every time we are faced with barriers to access, barriers to contribution, and barriers to benefit, we should try to dismantle these barriers so that the process of science is a lot more open. And very clearly, a system in which there is no way to benefit from the science that you do is a system that is not open. And whether it's been called open access or whether it's been called something else, trying to work against the notion of accessing of benefits is working against the principles of open science. one of the key arguments was against access with user registration. And as Temi summarized, the point here is that if you need to require extra step from the users, where you need to log into a system and give your identity or your email address in order to access information, that makes the process not open and is therefore not acceptable. And this is not true. This is not true in a variety of ways, most important of which is the status quo of a lot of databases that are considered open, especially by academics, require user registration and user authentication every time you access the data. The reason why academics in particular are so insistent on user registration and user authentication every time is because they want to protect their intellectual property when it comes to the data, and they want to make sure that they can claim the benefits of people using the data that they curate. And I think it is important to highlight that part of the academic communities have been trying to establish a double standard where academic databases would be under user registration, but databases for the PABS system would not. That is an entry point to digital exploitation of data, and I think it is very important to call this out every time it manifests. Though user registration is also definitely not opposed or antagonistic to database interoperability. What is understood currently by interoperability, and that is something that our colleague Tulio is going to be a lot more knowledgeable about that than I am. I'll just give a brief overview here. Whenever you have different databases, whenever data exists in different places, either the same data or different data, you want these databases to be able to talk to one another. That is largely a technical solution, and that is very largely something that is regulated by what is called the FAIR principle about data being findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. Yeah. So a key point in the FAIR principles is that you can perfectly expose only the information about the database, but require user registration to access the actual data. This is a well-established standard that is used by most of the leading data curation initiatives in academic research and in non-academic research, in R&D as well. And one of the key principles is that interoperability does not mean that you should have no user registration. Even if it's not a human user interacting with the databases, there are ways, there have been ways for the past 10, 15, 20 years where you can identify yourself as a machine, and so there is this full traceability, and it is also very well established practice in database access. So one of the things that the key point of what I wanted to start with is user registration is not antagonistic to open science. User registration is not incompatible with open access to databases. It is not compromising interoperability. The one thing that is really antagonistic to and incompatible with open science is pretending that we can focus only on access and cut people off from the benefits of doing science. I'm happy to elaborate on that at a later point, but I think I'd like to move on to Tulio at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Tim. Dr. Tulio, we would like to really listen to you. Essentially, probably begin with the understanding of the perspective of a data submitter and how data submitters' rights might be affected when there is a user registration and that essentially data access agreements are not in place. And of course, then that would lead to the next part of our discussion relating to the database infrastructure, who controls and who governs that. But before that, probably we would like, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Nathan, and thanks everyone who is with us today. So I'm speaking here from Brazil and from within our public health system, we're called SUS, and also from a broader Latin American experience of doing genomic surveillance with limited resources, but very strong commitments to solidarity and public service. So over the last years, our laboratories have generated and shared large volumes of pathogen sequence data during SARS-CoV-2, but also for dengue, Zika, chikungunya, and other emerging threats in the region, And we did this because we believe that sharing data quickly can save lives everywhere. But at the same time, we have experienced very clearly how easy our samples and sequences move across borders, while vaccines, diagnostics, and treatments, they move back much more slowly and often on terms that are not at all equitable. So when you ask me to speak about, why user registration and basic data access agreement with benefit sharing obligation should be seen as the minimum expectation of the PABS data sharing, I hear that question through this lived experience. So my short answer is that if PABS ask countries like Brazil to share pathogen sequence information rapidly and systematically, then at minimum, it must ensure that those who use that data are visible and bound by simple enforceable rules. Because without that, we are not talking about any partnership. We are really talking about structured extraction. So I'll start with what anonymous access actually looks like in concrete terms. So think about the typical situation in our region when a patient arrives at the SUS hospital here in Recife with severe respiratory symptoms. A nurse in the public system collects the sample, a public laboratory processes it, sets up the sequencing run, and a bioinformatics group assembles and curates the genome. All of this is paid for through public budgets and often stretched budgets, and carried out by professionals working under pressure, sometimes in under-resourced settings. And we upload that sequence to a global database that is or will be part of the PABS system. We are doing this in expectation that this will improve surveillance, help detect variants, and support global response. So if access to data is anonymous, from that moment, anyone in the world with sufficient technical capacity can download it without telling us who they are or what they intend to do. It might be a public health institute, which is good, but it might be a pharmaceutical company or a biotech startup or an AI company building proprietary models or a military lab. So we have no way to distinguish between those users, no way to know which sequences contributed to which products, and no real mechanism to ask that any of the benefits return to the health systems and communities that made this data possible in the first place. So from a Brazilian perspective, there is an additional layer. We already have a national system called SysGen to register research and development that uses Brazilian genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. In principle, if someone makes profit from using our genetic resources, they may have to share a portion of those benefits with the state and with our indigenous and traditional communities. But once pathogen sequences leave our institutions and enter anonymous international databases, the link to that national governance is effectively broken. So if the data are used later in a patent or in a commercial platform, there is no simple way to connect that and that use back to SysGen, to Brazil, or to the communities from which these samples ultimately derive from. So this is why, for me, anonymous access is not just a technical choice, as stated by Tammy. It is a political decision that undermines both international commitments and national laws designed to protect vulnerable populations. So this transforms the idea of global public goods into something quite one-sided. Our region provides the data as a public good, while the resulting technologies can still be treated as private goods when it comes to price, availability, and intellectual property. Now, I want to stress that the alternative we propose is not technically complicated. We're not asking for something that would cripple science and makes databases unusable. We are talking about two very basic elements: user registration and a simple standardized data access agreement, and ideally anchored at the WHO level. So user registration at its core is just the idea that you know who is using the data before downloading PABS tagged sequences. A user creates an account, provides institution affiliation and contact information, and understand that their access will be logged. This is the same basis model we all use every day for email services, academic journals, and even social media. And in genomics specifically, controlled access repository and secure analysis platforms already operates with logins, approval processes, and audit trails. And yet, they still support cutting-edge research, including international collaborations and large consortia. So when someone says, oh, if we require user registration, we'll kill open science, then I would answer, we already live in a world where some data are fully open and some are controlled, and scientists navigate that all the time. So our ability to download the genome sequence file in 2 seconds is not what made modern genomics possible. What made it possible are standards, tools, and collaboration. And registration does not prevent any of that. What registration does change is that it makes users visible and traceable, and that is precisely why it is resisted by some actors. The second element is basic data access agreement. Think of that as a standard set of rules that every registered user agrees to when they first request access to a PABS system. It does not have to be a 20-page legal contract negotiated case by case. It can be a concise document written in plain language, possibly with slightly different clauses for purely academic users and for commercial entities. But it should do a few things. First, it should require transparency. Users should acknowledge when PABS data contributed significantly to their work, whether in scientific publications, regulatory filings, or in patent applications. And this is not just recognition. It creates a documented link between the data and the outcomes. And the second should embed basic benefit sharing obligations. For commercial users, that might mean commitments to contribute to financial mechanisms on the PABS, to consider non-exclusive or socially responsible licensing practices, or to respect specific conditions on pricing and allocation of pandemic-related products in the countries that provide the data. For academic users, it might mean, for example, sharing analytic tools or capacity building with institutions in provided countries, or co-authorship and fair collaboration principles. And third, it should enable oversight. I think a WHO level agreement could allow aggregated reporting on how PABS data are used, by which type of institutions, and with what kinds of outputs. And that information is crucial for member states to evaluate whether the system is working as promised and to adjust rules if necessary.
Thank you, Dr. Tullio. Listening to the word transparency, I just remembered one statement of a stakeholder in the last IGWIG meeting during the public session with stakeholders and member states. The stakeholder actually asked the question to the government of Germany why they moved from hosting an open access database into anonymous models. Why are they calling non-transparent access models as open access? But there was no response from the government, from the delegation regarding, this particular question from the stakeholders. Moving on to, with our discussions, I just wanted to highlight that the Q&A is open. The audience can actually put questions into the Q&A. We will meanwhile take up 2 more rounds of discussion with the invited speakers. So the next round, we are trying to talk about or asking questions relating to the database infrastructure itself. Who currently dominates this particular structure, and why it should not be dominated by any particular region or any particular group of countries or even a single government or a group of governments, why it should be multilaterally governed. This is a question which is very, very critical to the discussions associated with PABS sequence information in IGWIG. Essentially, there are 2 proposals coming from the South relating to how to manage. The significant one is to have a working contractual relationship with databases and WHO, so that the terms determined by the member states collectively can be followed by the databases and as well as the users of those databases, which is the idea of WHO recognized databases. And then there was also proposals to build a database infrastructure. There are different views relating to how this particular infrastructure should be structured, whether it should be, developed through a particular centralized window to access data from WHO, whether there should be, it could be kind of a federated system where national countries develop these capacities or regions develop these capacities, and then it get integrated via certain specific portals? So there are these questions which been debated in the ICWIC floor. But what we have heard is that there is consistent resistance from certain group of countries, especially global north, to not to have any new infrastructures built, or also even to an extent not to have any working contractual relationship between databases and a WHO. And then there is this idea of WHO recognized databases, which I would say the word recognized itself was a kind of a trick to say that it is perhaps, not necessarily there is a relationship. It is just that an independent entity out there and we recognize them, right? So, but anyhow, there are proposals very clearly from the South that that kind of a relationship is not possible. There needs to be some contractual relationship. So over to you. What should be certain basic features of these infrastructure? May I invite Dr. Taimi or Dr. Tulio to begin with, whoever is comfortable to start? Dr. Taimi, would you like to?
Maybe Tulio can start, and then I can come after Tulio.
Okay, guys. So thanks so much, Nitin, for the question. So from my perspective, the way that the PABS infrastructure is being imagined is just as important as the legal text. And if we get the governance of these databases wrong, we can have beautiful principles on paper and still reproduce exactly the same power asymmetries we say we want to fix. So right now, most of the big genomic databases and the cloud infrastructure behind them are based and controlled in the global north. And that is a fact we live with every day as users. So in practice, it means that even when the data comes from our hospitals, our laboratories, and our communities, the systems that store, curate, and analyze those data are usually not under our governance and often not even under our jurisdiction. And when new drafts suggest that WHO would simply recognize database and ask them to follow their own internal policies rather than clear policies agreed by member states, it sounds at least to me, like cementing the status quo. So from my perspective, it is risky in the sense that it would mean that the PABS is built on an infrastructure where decisions are about access conditions, about how PABS tags are implemented, and about what gets logged and what is visible. And these decisions are effectively taken elsewhere. So even if those databases have good intentions, the primary accountability is to the host institutions and funders, not necessarily to the countries that provide most of the pathogen data. So recognition without conditions is not multilateralism. It seems outsourcing. And at the same time, I'm not convincing that simply building a big central database solves the problem either. If we create a central repository, but we staff it, host it in the cloud, and technically manage it to the same few actors from high-income countries, the center of gravity will not change. The question for us is less, where's the server? And it's more like who sets the rules, who changed them, and who has the capacity to participate on equal terms. So what would be, in my opinion, a better direction from my point of view? So first, any WHO recognized database that wants to handle PABS data should meet some mandatory conditions, not just rely on their internal policies. So for me, 3 are essential, and we discussed that. User registration with verified accounts, a standard PABS data access agreement applied to all users, and transparent, auditable logging of PABS-related access and use. If a database cannot meet these basic requirements, it should not be in the PABS ecosystem, in my opinion, because it cannot support traceability, benefit sharing, or biosecurity oversight. Second, I would like to see PABS infrastructure designed as a network rather than a single center. A WHO single window and identifier that can link multiple nodes, including national and regional platforms in the Global South. In Brazil, for example, we have systems like CGen for tracking use of our sample source, although at this point it cannot manage sequence information. But imagine if PABS identifiers could be recorded there, and if over time we could host at least part of our own pathogen data from the public health system in Brazilian or regional trusted environments that still interoperate globally, as mentioned by Tim. That would mean we are not only sending data out, we are also building durable capacity and foster skilled work at home. And third, and this is key, benefit sharing should explicitly support this kind of capacity building. Some countries in Latin America, in Africa and Asia, developing countries do not yet have sustainable funding to maintain genomic databases, high performance computing, or secure analysis environments. So if PABS ends up channeling most of the value into buying finished products from existing manufacturers and nothing into building data infrastructure in provider countries, then 10 years from now, we will still be depending on the same external platforms and making the same complaints. So when I look at the proposed approach, recognizing existing database and allowing them to essentially keeping what they already do, I worry that we are missing a big opportunity. We are creating a new system, but we are not using this opportunity to rebalance who owns and governs the infrastructure and skills that makes this system possible.
Thanks a lot for that response. May I ask Dr. Taimi and to be followed by Dr. Tim?
Thank you very much. I think that Tulio just set it up really well because I want to describe 2 decades of genomic science in Africa, because that's where I could speak from, is from Africa. I can't speak from anywhere else. So Africa is the one, and I'm treating it as the continent because we have very similar experiences throughout our continent, right? So the African countries are the ones you see in the headlines, right? South Africa identifies the Omicron variant. Nigeria and Kenya building sequencing hubs. The African Pathogen Genomics Initiative distributes, 70 sequencing platforms across 40 countries, right? And it's a genuinely impressive story of progress. That's the first thing. The second is that, sorry, I have people that have to just, I'm quickly putting off my camera. Sorry about that. What I can tell you also from my work as a scientist in Namibia and my colleagues across the region is that we have colleagues who attend these huge bioinformatics training workshops, and a third of them, when we talk about what is your experience, right, as a senior public health professional, they have never done any dry lab or computational work at all. They've been working with Global North funders for decades, but only about 15% of them had any sort of experience with advanced sequence analysis. And some of that is just watching someone do the sequence analysis. It's not even writing a code, right? They could extract nucleic acid, they could run a PCR, they could, do the sequencing runs. But when that sequence came out, they didn't know what to do with it. And that gap between the data being generated and the capacity to analyze it on our own terms is exactly what we feel the current WHO database or system fails to address. And that's exactly why, what we've spoken about, the mandatory user registration, the verified accounts, the data access agreements would begin to fix that. Not because the paperwork builds the capacity, but it's because the accountability will create the data trail that makes the investment and the partnership and the enforcement possible, right? So if we look at Africa, we have about 53, and don't quote me on that exact number, but more than 50 out of the 55 African Union member states have in-country sequencing capacity, right? That's huge progress. But a sequence sitting in an unanalyzed, sitting on a desktop unanalyzed in Windhoek doesn't protect Namibian patients, right? A sequence uploaded to a Global North database, analyzed by a Global North team, published in a Global North journal, and used to develop a product that Namibia cannot access, that does not serve Namibia either, right? It serves the pipeline. Our data is that raw material, yet we are not reliably the beneficiaries, right? And we see that these donor-driven development models have just reinforced this imbalance. countries with stronger visibility in global health programs, they attract the greater sequencing investment. Others with equally pressing needs remain under-resourced and overlooked, right? So a lot of laboratories operate on project-specific funding, right? Meaning that they cannot retain their trained personnel or maintain that equipment after the grant cycle ends, right? The capacity exists only project to project, and then sovereignty is not, it doesn't exist structurally. So we have to ask ourselves, but then why is the capacity for the databases not being developed, right? And that is because we want to maintain the status quo. We want to make sure that we are only capacitating where we are able to control. And so I had a conversation with some people engaged here last week, and it is, from my point of view, from where I'm standing, and I've been the training that I've had, the servers that we've had to set up, all of these things, you don't need that much to set up a database in country. But again, it's not only the technical know-how or the technical will, it has to have that political buy-in as well. I think that is sort of, I don't want to go I don't want to go further into this, but I think that we also have to really talk about academics taking responsibility and putting stricter conditions on academics from the north accessing materials and sequence information from the south, because we don't have the equal responsibility on those scientists in the global south than they even have in their own countries. The regulations that they have to follow, the reuser registration, the contracts that they follow in their own countries, they are requesting not to follow in our countries. And I think that is completely inappropriate. But I'll stop for now and give over to Tulio.
Thank you, Dr. Taimi. I would invite Dr. Tim to probably take on with this question relating to database infrastructure, how he see it. Also, there are certain questions relating to the cost associated with building databases and the value it would generate, etc. Perhaps you might also want to address some of this. Essentially, as far as I understand, that you were also trying to build some form of data sharing platform with one of our colleagues, called Verena. So you might want to share some experiences. Thank you.
Sure. I'll start with the value of data, I think. And I'm a biodiversity scientist before I'm anything else, and all of the biodiversity data is accessed through a single database, which is called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, that everyone who is a policymaker, the agency scientist, a researcher, citizen scientist, whoever, uses a single point of entry. That was a massive financial investment at the scale of an entire field. But 2-3 years ago, I think they commissioned a report trying to quantify how much this was worth. And what the finding of this report was that for every euro, it's a European-based initiative, right? But for every euro invested, they generated 3 euros of direct financial benefits. And they generated an estimated 12 euros in a whole of society derived benefits. And so the value of open data it goes far beyond the cost of infrastructure. It goes through what are we able to do now that this volume of data exists. And GBIF, I think, is really noteworthy because they are expecting user registration and user authentication. So it is widely considered to be an important open database for policymaking. The Convention on Biological Diversity has advised all of their member states that they should be contributing financially and joining GBIF. But it's also built on this user registration principle. It is open and it is generating a lot of revenues for society and a lot of benefits. That being said, there are still challenges to building databases, but my impression in listening into some of this conversation during the PABS system negotiation in particular is that these difficulties have been vastly exaggerated by some groups. And very recently, over the past few months, notably the Pasoplexus database has been saying that it is not possible to do user registration. This is not true. They might not want to do it because they think it will cut them off from sources of funding and because it will not be compatible with different things that they want to do. But there is no technical limitation to user registration. It's been done for much larger volumes of data. It's been done for much more sensitive data as well. And there is often a lack of a will to do user registration, but it's not a lack of technical ability. And I think Tammy is right in saying that it's difficult, it is expensive, but it's not that expensive compared to the rest of the scientific infrastructure, especially, managing wet labs, for example. And there's been very often, there has been this confusion between the current state of databases and what the databases should be if we are willing to invest a little bit more resources and funding into making sure that they're fully compatible with a strong PABS system. And I think that is an important distinction. The database as it currently exists and the database as it could exist with a little bit more development are two entirely distinct entities. 2 years ago, I think we published a paper called the Listen Principle, where we sort of developed a roadmap for how we could build a database that would be fully compliant with the PABS system, the strongest possible incarnation of PABS system, fully compatible with open science principles. And it turns out that it's not a particularly difficult engineering challenge. And it's also not a particularly difficult intellectual property law challenge. So we worked with lawyers from the Creative Commons Foundation, who are the curators of some of the most important open science licenses. And it was a couple of weeks of thinking about what the intellectual property rules of the PABS system would be like, and they already fully align with what is understood to be open science. So the conception of database, that's where I really wanted to end up. It's a technical challenge, but it's not a difficult technical challenge. It's a governance challenge, but it's also something that has been solved in other fields and that we could be taking inspiration from. And the point of reference that we have is that if this investment is worth it, because GBIF in particular has been able to create 10 times more value than the investment that it required. And that is for biodiversity, something that is really, really important, but it's not nearly quite as mission critical as having a database that will be used to develop vaccines and life-saving therapeutics for a pandemic. And so it is really important to think a little bit ahead of where databases currently are and to give them a strong mandate to do what is right. And there's a lot of consideration that have been brought for the past round of negotiation that it is too difficult. They were never fully right, and they never felt fully honest. And I think it is very important to ask a lot more precision when someone say, oh, this is technically infeasible. There are many things that are technically feasible as soon as we have a little bit more resources and also a little bit more goodwill to actually do them.
Right. Thank you, Tim. So we'll move on to the third round and then we take up the questions. The third round is essentially on a larger question regarding the open, the kind of research infrastructure, research ecosystem, which already Dr. Taimi started talking about. How a database infrastructure with user registration and data access agreement would also bring in academics, public health, public research institutions into the ambit of access and benefit sharing, and why they should also be responsible under access and benefit sharing laws. There are several reasons for this, and the speakers might want to address it one by one. Also, I would like to probably, as a introduction to some of these issues, just wanted to think or maybe understand that people talk about this as a very novel idea, and people talk about this as building such an infrastructure or having a user registration facility or something, cutting off access to pathogen data from the rest of the data existing in the world. I don't know how that sounds to you. We also know there are databases existing, again, managed by entities like European Molecular Biology Laboratories, which seeks a user registration. Like, for example, the one which I think EGA, not ENA, right? The Phenome Genome Archive. So there are these examples out there where people, as Tim was saying in the beginning, interact between these various types of databases without any problem, without raising any concerns until now. Suddenly, when there is going to have certain benefit sharing responsibilities, we see a lot of opposition, but that's fine. I mean, it is important that as a stakeholder, everyone should raise their concerns. Everyone should raise their questions, right? So I would probably now invite Dr. Taimi to begin with. Why do she think that academics should also take a stronger responsible? What sort of benefits we can expect from them? And do you have some thoughts about, like, I'm taking it from one of the questions which I received in chat, where some of the academics or researchers are not necessarily associated with an institution or a university or something like that. Of course, I have answers to this question, but just I'm sure you will also have your own views on these issues, like citizen journalist or scientist, etc. So, Dr. Taimi, over to you.
All right. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I think that there are a number of things that one should address here. And the first thing is that, of course, I believe very strongly that academics have to share benefits. And I want to get it right off the bat that things such as co-authorship on publications is not a benefit, because that is standard scientific practice. Just because people are not doing it does not mean that it is not standard practice, right? We actually had a situation this week as well where a global North person, I won't say collaborator, was trying to strong arm his way onto a publication that we were doing. And we had to draw a line and say, well, there are certain rules that go with publication, but that's sort of the kind of I don't want to say energy, but that is an exploitive relationship. That's not a collaborative relationship, right? And what we see is that a lot of the times there is one collaborator that comes with the funding and that wants to call all of the shots, right? And so a lot of times what we see is the funding from a grant goes to a specific university. And when you are applying for a grant, there is a certain percentage of that grant that will go to the university as an overhead. So not only will the university be gaining benefits through the publication of this data and through the publication of their scientist journals and all of that, but they're also going to be getting monetary benefits just as being the university where this researcher is affiliated to. So we are saying that the benefits that should be shared by those academic users that have to be identified through contracts and then subsequent user registration, those have to be worked into the grant. And when you say to me that a researcher is not going to be affiliated with an institution, then perhaps with other types of pathogens, that may be the case, but I struggle to see how a researcher who is looking at developing vaccine targets or identifying vaccine targets, or who's looking at pathogens with pandemic potential, is going to be a single researcher that's got a BSL-3 set up in their garage, right? That to me just sounds a little bit preposterous, or absurd. So the thing is that we expect there to be a certain type of researcher or academic or a certain group that is going to be involved in research related to PPPs. I understand that it's a little bit different for the dry lab side, and that you might have people that are developing aptamers and such, but even for when you're looking at more the computational work, you still have to develop that aptamer, you have to have it synthesized, and then you have to look at the target or whatever else you may want to be doing next. So I think that saying that you have a an academic who's not affiliated with the institution or with a institution, that in itself is nonsensical because all academics have to be affiliated with institutions at some level anyway. And as far as benefit sharing is concerned, I think that is, in my very personal opinion, I'm not speaking on behalf of any country here. I'm not speaking on behalf of my institution. I have to say that I think that is the big push as to why they don't want to have, why certain member states don't want to have user registration. And they want to sort of downgrade the benefits that academics can share, because the current system is set up to only advance the academics that are already in a well-to-do, resourced institution, right? So we see enormous value flowing back to those institutions through grants, through journal incentives, through speaking engagements, through stipends that they get. So yeah, this is one of those things that gets me a little bit hot and bothered, but it's precisely the point of the user registration, is that we have to make sure that anyone that's benefiting from the pathogens with pandemic potential, either materials or sequence information, and that's something that I wanted to mention, that it's not a term that should be decoupled. Yes, we understand that in the scientific world that those two are separate components, but when we're talking about access and benefit sharing, you have to treat those two things as the same. Whether you are accessing materials or whether you're accessing sequence information, the benefits that flow to the providers have to be equal. I think that I'll rest for now.
Thank you. May I invite Dr. Tulio now?
Yes, absolutely, Nathan. And yeah, thanks, Tammy, for her reflection, which I really agree. So yeah, listening to this debate about whether academics should be subject to terms of use and benefit sharing obligations, I feel personally, because I'm both an academic and a public health practitioner, so I know the fears that many colleagues have, that new conditions will mean more forms to fill, slow access to data, or even constraint on academic freedom. But those concerns are understandable. But from where I sit in Brazil, working inside the public health system and in collaboration with other Latin American groups, I also know who pays the price when we treat academic use as somehow outside any obligation. So most of the pathogen sequencing we are talking about here is not done in private, profit-seeking companies. It's usually done in public laboratories, universities, and research institutes, funded by taxpayers, and during emergencies, by emergency relocations from already stretched health budgets. So the samples come from patients in public hospitals, from communities, say in the Amazon, from people who may not even have secure access to primary care, let alone cutting-edge therapies that might eventually be developed. So when we upload those sequences to international systems, we rarely do so as private individuals, as Tammy has raised. We do it as part of institutional and national efforts. So if academics are then told you are exempt from terms of use, you do not need to think about the benefit sharing that's only for industry, then we create a gap that others can easily exploit. For example, companies can build on academic analysis, on academic reference data sets, on academic profiles that could all rely on PABS data. And by the time the product appears, it looks like the link to the original data is too diffuse to matter. So in practice, that means the public health systems and communities that enable the science are left with, recognition in the acknowledgement section, but no structural return. So I also think that there is a misconception about what it means in practice for academics to be under PABS terms. No one is proposing that every PhD student needs to negotiate a bespoke contract before, running a phylogenetic tree. What we are talking about, is a light and clear framework to register a user, accept a standard set of conditions, and commit to a few basic principles. Transparency about when you use PABS tag data, respect for any protected traditional knowledge, fair collaboration with partners in provider countries, and where you work, leads to where your work leads to commercialization or patents, recognition that benefit sharing obligations follow the data next into the next phase. So from my perspective, this is not really more burdensome than what many of us already do. We already apply to ethics committees, sign data use agreements, comply with funder policies, and open access data sharing. And adding a PABS specific layer that's designed to protect the countries and communities whose data we rely on feels like a threat and more like of an ethical alignment of our practice, with our discourse on global health equity. So in summary, my view is this. Academics should absolutely be inside the PABS framework, not outside it. The conditions should be proportionate and administratively simple, but they should exist. We should not romanticize academic work as somehow detached from the broader political economy of knowledge and innovation. The reality is that our analysis, our reference data sets, our pipelines, and often our foundation on which commercial and policy decisions are made. And touching on the citizen science issue, I agree with Tammy in the sense that this should not be an excuse to have user registration and sharing benefits out of that. And not only because I mentioned about the potential for exploitation from companies, but for example, if you have anonymous users, how can you differentiate a citizen scientist from a terrorist? That's my question.
Thank you, Dr. Tullio. I would go to Dr. Tim now, even though I have a request from Dr. Taimi to address some of the chats which have come to us, especially regarding her response to the questions previously made. So I request Dr. Tim now, and then I'll come back to Dr. Taimi. Also, after which soon I will take up the questions which I've seen in the Q&A.
Sure, thank you, Nathan. So I want to follow up on all of that from maybe a slightly different point of view. For the past almost 15 years now, I've been doing research that is entirely in a dry lab. So I don't do field work. I don't do lab work, which means that 100% of my research is dependent upon open data. Right? So if there is no open data, I don't do any research. That's as simple as it is. And one of the things that is important to mention, I think, is that it's never been an issue with productivity. Even so, the overwhelming majority of the open data resources that we use require user registration, and more stronger than that, constant user authentication, right? And I interact with open databases by providing my login credential every day, multiple times a day. I've been doing so for the past 10, 15 years. It never once stood between me and doing research. And I think that is really important because it's been agitated as, if we require user registration, it's going to stop research. That is profoundly untrue. And I think this is belying a fear that some people may have that is not grounded in reality because it's not grounded in any significant experience in interacting with open data. And as an academic, I also can literally count on the finger of one hand the number of times where I had to interact with a lawyer to negotiate a data transfer agreement. And I've had to do that a couple of times over the past 2-3 years. And it was always consistently because I had to access databases that were not open. And quite the contrary, actually, I think the more open databases are, the easier the work of academics is going to be. As a biodiversity scientist, I'm also seeing this whole quote-unquote conversation we had around the Nagoya Protocol play out again, because it is very true that a part of the academic community wants benefit sharing for them, but not benefit sharing for others. And I think Tullio was right in calling it the romanticization of academic work, and we need to stop with this. We are doing work that is not different. We're doing work that is foundational in a sense, but also derivative in some others. And it is a moral obligation for the academic community to understand when we're being part of exploitative practices and to put a stop to it. And whenever we are whatever. Some academics keep advocating for open access to data, whatever that means, I think, is keeping this right for open exploitation of genetic resources, which I think is clearly unacceptable. And the concern of if there is user registration, that gives databases the potential to cut off access for some categories of users. And so a question that came back in the chat a couple of times, what about citizen scientists? What about advocacy groups that rely on these databases to do their work, and they're not necessarily affiliated with university or an institution? That happened. There's been a case where a database decided unilaterally to cut access to initiatives that were working for public health, and this database is GISED, right? And so it's very important, I think, to understand that whenever we have a strong regulation of user registration in the context of open data, that also come with obligation for the databases to behave in a way that is transparent and to behave in a way that is open. Open is never a one-way relationship. So if we have a database that is open with user registration, it is very clear what is allowed to do and what is not allowed to do. And in the context of open science, this is overwhelmingly done through the Creative Commons licenses that are really well understood and designed to be really simple because they want to support the kind of work that we are rightfully worried about encouraging, which is accessing this data to keep tabs on the spread of viruses with pandemic potential, keeping tab of open data, mapping COVID-19 lineages, this sort of thing. It is crucially important for society, for public health, and for a thriving open data ecosystem. And that can only be correctly protected if we are operating under clear principles of governance for the open databases. We wrote a short piece early November last year with my colleague Colin Carlson in Seeing Global Health about the need for a trustworthy viral sequence database that was inspired by the fact that GISED has been cutting off access. And no, we see GISED sometimes mentioned as a possible solution for a PABS system. No, it is a nonsense argument, I think, that to have a database that has a history of unilaterally cutting off access to people that they disagree with cannot support an open system for equitable access to digital sequence information. But I think Temi wanted to follow up on this as well, so I'm happy to learn the rest of the time.
I've seen 3 questions, so I'll raise this question and then hand over to Taimi and Tulio to respond. And probably, Tim, if you want to take one more round, probably we have time we can take. Otherwise, I would like to conclude. So the 3 questions are definitely from one individual, Priti Patnaik. She's asking the questions like, first one, can speakers respond to concerns that user registration can impede research and development as asserted by developed countries? The second one is, can governments insist conditionalities on researchers accessing and sharing data? Developed countries have argued that this is not legally possible. I'm not sure whether that question, that statement of developed countries are valid in itself, because we have already shown in the first presentation that Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as European Union law, all says that this is feasible. And the third question is also regarding any ballpark assessment of the cost setting up a PABS database as distinct from existing ones. So with this, I also open give the floor to Dr. Taimi. She would like to respond.
Thank you so much. I actually want to respond to some other questions by Sherry in the
Chat.
that we got. Yeah, in the chat. So I specifically, we were talking about unaffiliated actors in terms of scientists, right? And why I specifically spoke about it being absurd is because throughout the negotiations, we've heard about a single PhD student, that one PhD student that has to sign a contract and they're working. I don't know where that person is working, but it's a person who was doing a PhD that's unaffiliated with a research institution. So that was why I was specifically referring to, right? And I just want to say that the registration is not, it doesn't equate to exclusion, right? So already we've spoken about databases like GIS8 that requires a registration from independent researchers, from journalists, from citizen scientists, and they register quite successfully, right? So the barrier is not the institutional affiliation; it is the clarity about the purpose and the obligations, right? That is connected to that. If you are doing some kind of tracing, if you're a journalist that is tracing the origins of an mRNA vaccine, for example, you're not doing R&D, you're not doing research and development on genetic or biochemical composition, right? You are investigating what happened to the data that was used to develop products. So in those terms, there would be no benefit sharing obligations because you are tracing this. In the same way, you would probably not need access to that sequence because what are you going to be doing with the sequence? You want to be able to trace that sequence, right? And we've spoken about having tiered databases where a well-defined system could offer this simplified tiers that could allow for non-commercial accountable use, such as for journalists, for education, whatever, versus the fully commercial use that is done with R&D users, right? So throughout the negotiation, there's been very clear distinction between different purposes have to have different obligations, right? And so I think that you shouldn't think about when I say unaffiliated, accountable users, and when I'm talking about that being a service, I'm specifically talking about these scientists that are doing research and development who are being framed as being unaffiliated because in our world, in the scientific world, there is no scientist that's going to work on pathogens with pandemic potential that's not going to be affiliated with the university, right? But the registration does not mean that you as journalists or citizen science will be excluded. It just means that there will be some kind of trail. And actually, it would make your life a lot easier as a journalist to try and investigate where or try and trace that sequence information that led to that. Thank you.
I'll invite Dr. Tulio, but maybe before that, there are a couple of messages coming. Maybe Dr. Tulio, please go ahead and then we will summarize what is in the chat. Yeah.
Okay, Nathan. Thanks. So from the legal aspect, like I have no deep knowledge about that, but Tammy touched on, this the thing about the registration and everything. That is not an excuse not to implement that. That is possible. There are ways to consider authentic citizen scientists, journalists, etc., but keeping their responsibilities in check. The other thing that was raised was regarding costs for a PABS database. I think we should not think about cost first. We need to think like investment because we've seen the value of genomics and genomic infrastructure, not only to track and trace pathogens, but to develop accurate diagnostics and vaccines. And the literature has plenty of that, not only for SARS-CoV-2, but for many others, for our preparedness, etc. So from my perspective, as I mentioned before, I don't think that a single massive database would do the job. I think the member states should commit to investing in their local infrastructure, and that includes computational infrastructure, bioinformatics, capacity building, etc. And the member states, of course, collaborate with this, so it doesn't, because, for example, when I talked about cloud infrastructure and, highly skilled people in AI and other developments, and even how to translate that into diagnostics and vaccines, that's dominated by the global north. So how do we transfer that knowledge and experience so we strengthen our systems and we build skills and we build foundations for collaborative work, skilled work in in the developing countries. So I think the member states should commit to investing locally in this kind of infrastructure. And what we need under PABS would be defining, based on the legal terms that are defined, the rules that are set, that are consolidated. Then we build standards where multiple data infrastructures can communicate and be truly interoperable through this PABS system, so that, for example, you can have specific identifiers for samples, for sequences, and that exchange can be tracked and traced, and that truly reflects benefit sharing. That's what I believe that's the way to go.
Thank you, Dr. Tulio. I would now, perhaps it's time, we would like to probably conclude, but I'll definitely give one more round of 1-minute interventions for all of you. But just before that, want to respond to a couple of chats, especially thanks to a couple of friends who have been offered some assistance to us in terms of reaching out to masses about these issues and how the negotiations are going on, helping us, saying that they would be helpful to build how to say this narrative in a way which would basically reach us to public. So thanks a lot for that support. Jolly Downcho, if I'm correct with pronouncing your name, I'm really sorry for that. I also see a question from Uganda relating to from Mugabwa Owen. Relating to the question relating to the new agreement signed by African countries, or MOU signed by African countries and US. Of course, it's not necessarily a question connected. I mean, of course, it is related, but not directly to the question under consideration today. But yesterday in our webinar, we addressed this question very specifically. Just want to repeat the answer. So as of now, we haven't seen that PABS system creating an exclusive system, avoiding sovereign states or excluding sovereign states' rights to share it outside of the system if they are doing some bilateral arrangements with some people or some entities, etc. So perhaps you might have to have a balance between multilateral and bilateral negotiations for access and benefit sharing systems. But this is where the importance of PABS system comes. If the PABS system sets up the benchmark, right, then we would not see, I would say, inequitable demands or unreasonable demands which we saw from the United States on the African countries, right? Because you already have a system, a multilaterally governed system, a fair and equitable system where you can rely on. And then if someone like US, who's not a party to the system, comes and asks you, you can say, hey, look, I am doing this. If you want to give me something more, then we will try to consider your agreement, right? So it is important why we set a real benchmark when it comes to the PABS system. It cannot be a weaker system where we would be then further bullied by other people around the world. Oh, you are anyway not getting anything from the PABS system, so better you give it here in these terms and conditions, right? So that would be a real problem. With that, I would like to also move on to, also I want to give a small response, a personal anecdotal response, because I am not a scientist. I am a civil society person working with social science research and legal research, and how I have met with issue of access in some of the databases which has been already mentioned in this debate. So to be just, because that would give you the real picture, right? When I have applied to one of these databases for registration, user registration, it was delayed for several reasons, right? And why and how could I solve? And one of these databases is recommended by WHO in one of their legal instruments. We even asked WHO, what would you do in this case? Because my access is now not set up, and there are certain scientists saying that their access has been cut down. Now, you say this is a recommended database. What would you do for us, right? What is the remedy you have for us? And they were completely silent in that meeting, right? So this is what we want to avoid. We want to have a structure where scientists or the users should have legal remedies or fair remedies if some of these things have denied to them, right? So that means we need accountable databases connected with the multilateral system, governed collectively by the member states, right? So that database structure should be something like of that sort. Also, with regard to the database agreements, if you go through the GBIF website, right, there are two data access agreements, I believe. you can see how simple it is written, right? How user-friendly it is written. To add on to certain conditions relating to Article 12 benefit sharing into some of those databases, some of those data access agreement would never be a legally complicated thing. It would be very easy, user-friendly, easily understandable stuff, right? So that's where it stands. And I just want to give one round of last 1 minute step. I start with Dr. Tim, Dr. Tulio, and then to Dr. Taimi.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you everyone for the very stimulating question as well. I'll be very brief. The question of the cost is incredibly important. The cost of developing a database is I cannot give you a dollar figure right now. One thing I know that it is far, far lower than the cost of the excess mortality due to lack of access to vaccines during COVID-19. And I think it's really important to emphasize that this is what we're up against, not only economic considerations. I agree with the need to build local capacity in access to computing power. That remains very expensive. That remains exceedingly expensive to maintain. And the costs, the environmental cost of operating a data center, no matter what the use is really, really high. And so in countries that are currently facing challenges with, for example, access to water or reliability of the power grid, a computing center for a database might be an extra burden. But I think if the solution is not necessarily national, then maybe the solution is something that is more regional, and there is a multilateral partnership to develop these data centers. But I think there is, I agree with the need for distributed capacity. And if this is designed in a way that has interoperability in mind, then this will establish de facto a globally data commons that is compatible with the PABS system. So thank you.
Tulio, Dr. Tulio.
Yeah, so thanks, Nadine. So yeah, I've touched on those topics, and I'll just add on to that last question that you brilliantly answered as well, is that I'm personally concerned about these bilateral agreements if their interest would be to get around WHO and the PABS system, because coming from the bilateral agreements coming from the global north towards the global south makes the global south very vulnerable depending on the terms, and these terms can be very asymmetric. So that I have a lot of concern around that these could undermine the solutions that we are trying to build, just because of the use of political and economic force, and especially considering that in developing countries, a lot of the investment in genomics to date, there is a lot of funding coming from the global north. And we need to be mindful of that in terms of these bilateral agreements, and if they are being used to get around responsibility and global solidarity and global health. These are my last view, like, especially with this very important and delicate question that I'm very concerned.
Dr. Taimi, would you like to?
Thanks. I think from our perspective, or from a Namibian scientist perspective, we all contributed Omicron sequences, right? Or COVID sequences. And the world used it to assess vaccines, develop treatments, guide policy. And what happened in response is that Africa got 25% vaccine coverage, right? While the richer countries got 73% vaccine coverage. And that's exactly the equity problem that we want PABS to fix, right? The registration and the data access agreements, the contracts, they don't block accountability work or civil society access. They don't stop science. They create the legal architecture that ensures that when provider countries' biological or biology or biological resources generates global value, that they get an enforceable share, right? We're not asking science to slow down. We're asking it to include us as legal partners, not just as data sources. So traceability enables both transparency and benefit sharing. And without it, we'll just keep contributing the variants and waiting at the back of the queue for the vaccines, right? The infrastructure for accountability or for accountable access exists. We've heard it here today. The question is whether we're going to use it to build the equity or whether we're just going to continue with this extractive business, this extractive norm as per usual. And quite frankly, as a scientist that's working in the global south in infectious diseases, that's working on training the next generation of scientists, I do not want to perpetuate the status quo. I want to be part of that generation that actually changes how we do things in the scientific community.
Thank you, Dr. Taimi, and thanks a lot to all the speakers and all those people who have attended the meeting have raised a very important question. As a moderator, let me take one last statement. Probably I'm not just showing a slide which I prepared. I wanted to say in the beginning, but I then thought it is important for the speakers to comment and then probably understand. I mean, probably state this. It's very clear from our point of view, that anonymous access to PABS sequence information is violative of violates or abridges Article 12 of Pandemic Agreement. Especially does violate the principle of equal footing. It also is inconsistent with the objectives of conventional biological diversity, which means Article 1 of conventional biological diversity and Nagoya Protocol are both affected. Now we move on to Article 15 of the International Covenants on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which speaks about right to science and right to enjoyment of scientific progress. Very, very clear. And this has also been abridged or violated when anonymous access is promoted, especially because the rights of the contributor scientist is affected, especially also the right of human right to enjoy from the scientific benefits, like the medicines, is also being affected. So Article 15 is also being abridged. And then we move on to the principles of open science, which I showed in the beginning of UNESCO recommendation on open science 2021. This also is being inconsistent when you promote anonymous access. And ironically, this is all being objected from countries from global north. But if you look at their laws, they have laws and systems to protect these rights within their countries and within their territories. And when it comes to our wish to secure these rights, realize these rights in our territories, we are being denied opportunities, especially in developing countries. I'm not going to the two other slides which I have. You can see on the left edge of my my screen, with slide number 11 and 12, which talks about EU regulations, how this actually has to be. I mean, if EU delegation pays attention to these regulations of within EU, they should be definitely withdrawing the resistance against the proposals coming from data governance from the global south. And I request at this stage all those who have attended this meeting, both governmental officials, civil society friends, scientists, and many others in this field, to actually talk to their governments, both global north and south, to clearly set the stage for a better equitable data sharing ecosystem, a better research and development ecosystem. And this is the opportunity. It should not be missed. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Nitin.
Thanks, Nitin. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.